Okay, this is not going to be a "Have you heard about ChatGPT" course. We are way past that. And if you're watching this, I'm going to assume you're already using or have certainly used one or more of the generative AI chatbots. Probably ChatGPT, but it could be Google Gemini or Anthropic Claude or Microsoft's Copilot or Meta AI. Maybe you're using one of the others because we also have Grok and Perplexity and Hugging Chat and Poe and Pi. And this is one of the problems with generative AI services, is how to deal with the ever-increasing number of options, and we'll get to that. But in addition to those general purpose options, some of you may also be using a generative AI application that's built for a specific business function, like using Jasper for marketing or Gamma for making presentations. For software developers, there's tools like GitHub Copilot to generate code, create unit tests, help with code review. And I'm going to talk a little later about this marketplace of generative AI. But also, you might work for a company that right now is integrating generative AI into their own products and services, possibly with varying degrees of success. But set all of that aside for the moment, because I talk to a lot of people who go through a similar journey, a similar experience with generative AI. And one of the things I hear again and again is when people feel like they're just scratching the surface of this, where you've gone past the initial stages of using generative AI. Maybe you've used ChatGPT to rewrite some emails or summarize documents or draft a proposal or suggest a schedule for an upcoming event. Maybe you've experimented with image generation and you recognize this could be extremely powerful, but you're just not quite sure how to make better use of it. It's this sense of, okay, I've been using generative AI for a few basic tasks. Now what? And that's what we're going to talk about here, is that now what? What that means is I'm not going to talk here as if you're an absolute beginner to all of this, but I'm also not going to talk as if you're an expert. I'll assume you're at least reasonably comfortable with basic generative AI ideas like how to write prompts and core terminology like LLMs, large language models. But I don't assume that everybody watching this is just as comfortable with concepts like retrieval augmented generation or generative AI agents. And those are just a couple of the things we'll be covering in this course. So if you are a complete beginner to this, you might find it a little hard going. At the other end of the scale, if you're a machine learning engineer and you're already training your own local LLMs and you're building RAG systems and using LangChain and AutoGen, you probably don't need this. I'm looking for that middle ground of, I've started using generative AI, now what? How do I get to the next level? What are the kinds of things I could be or should be using this for? I'm going to talk about two different aspects of this. First is using generative AI products and services yourself, just as an individual, your own day-to-day tasks in the workplace, but also the additional aspects and problems and possibilities when you use generative AI within an organization and on your team or for a specific project or product. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about generative AI products and services and dealing with the marketplace, how to find the tools and services that might be useful for you, and maybe point out a few products and services you might not have encountered yet. And when you are looking at multiple different options, I want to give you a lightweight approach, a framework to quickly evaluate those competing services, because there is a lot of competition and we expect that to continue. And we'll talk about integrating generative AI into existing workflows and processes, and how to combine these services with agents, and hopefully just how to think about all of this in a more useful way. If that sounds good, let's get into this. I'm Simon Allardyce, and welcome to Generative AI in Action. So let's begin with the problem. And I don't mean this high-level problem of just how do we make better use of generative AI, but that there are several specific problems we encounter when we move beyond just purely personal use of these tools and think about implementing generative AI within an organization, whether that's an enterprise-level organization or even just a small to medium business. And I'm going to say the best way to think about these problems is to ask a very simple and slightly exaggerated question. Why don't we just use ChatGPT for everything? You know, why don't we just provide everybody in the company with a basic ChatGPT account or a basic Gemini account or a basic Claude account, and then pat ourselves on the back and say, we don't need to do anything else. We have now implemented generative AI across the organization. What's wrong with that? Yeah, okay. Few people would genuinely suggest this because while providing basic access to a generative AI chatbot might help with some situations like revising emails and summarizing documents, there are five big problems this would not solve, regardless of what kind of business you're in or what size of business you're in. Problem number one: ChatGPT, by default, has no knowledge of or access to your company's private data. The documents, presentations, applications, spreadsheets, PDFs, calendars, group chats, whatever you need in your day-to-day business, it doesn't know about any of that stuff. And to be clear, I am not just talking about confidential information like healthcare data or financial data or trade secrets. Sure, that's part of this. But even more fundamentally, even the data you would be happy to share with the world, your public-facing documents, your knowledge base, your product information. Most LLMs weren't trained on that. They don't know anything about it. Next, LLMs have a knowledge cutoff point. They are trained to a specific point in time, and you cannot assume they have up-to-date knowledge about anything. For example, I was recording this as the Paris Olympics were finishing in August 2024. But if I asked Claude about any of the results that had happened for this largest sporting event on the planet, it had no idea because the data it was trained on at the time was only valid up to April. It was actually kind of refreshing to have a chatbot that admits when it doesn't know something. At least it didn't just try and hallucinate a result. Now, these days, some AI chatbots like ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini, they will try and go out to the web for more real-time, up-to-date results when they realize you're asking about things that happened after their knowledge cutoff. But that information is not in the LLM itself. And okay, this idea that when a generative AI model does not have authoritative, up-to-date information and that it's going to need a way to use some additional source of data, that is a useful idea. That is important, and we're going to come back to it. And problem number three is the potential for hallucinations. While the LLMs have generally gotten better at this, it is still a problem. You ask a question, and an LLM is going to do its best to generate a realistic and convincing answer. That is not the same as a true answer. And related to this is the idea of a lack of accountability. Even something as simple as just getting a direct and specific attribution. Okay, if the LLM is giving me an answer, where does that answer come from? Now, depending on your business or your use case, this might be just a nice to have, but it might be essential. If you're using generative AI to help draft contracts or legal documents, you're using it for research or trying to find precedents, you're going to need an LLM that can do better than just saying, "Trust me, bro," when you ask it for sources. You often need trustable, verifiable citations and source documents. And LLMs typically don't do very well at that. It's not what they're built to do. They're not just databases where you can look something up. And finally, for the moment at least, is the idea of ethical and legal problems. That could include things like algorithmic bias, but also liability issues. So if you build a customer-facing chatbot, and that chatbot gives a customer an incorrect answer, a hallucinated answer, is your company then liable for any impact of that? And right now, precedents would suggest yes, probably. And okay, there is some overlap between all these problems, and there's also overlap in the ways that we can deal with them, but it typically relies on having something in addition to just an off-the-shelf LLM. Generative AI large language models have some common limitations they all share, like they can hallucinate incorrect results. They have a knowledge cutoff point. They don't know about your private data. Now, when you're using generative AI just personally as an individual, these might not be a big deal. I mean, you don't expect ChatGPT to know about the documents on your own desktop computer. You could tolerate the occasional incorrect answer. If Midjourney gives you a weird image, you can just ask it to generate another one. But when you're using it within a business, these become more significant. And one of the main approaches to deal with them is to use something called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. Now, occasionally people have this misconception that RAG is an alternative to using a large language model like GPT or Gemini or Llama or Claude. It's not. RAG is something we do in addition to having an LLM. It's something we add on. It's a way to provide additional data for that LLM. So just as a very basic overview, in a simple, straightforward generative AI application without RAG, so like a basic chatbot, the user would send a prompt to an application, whether that's a website or a mobile app, and then behind the scenes, the app would forward that on to the LLM to formulate response, to generate that response, and send it back to the user. And this is using only the information the LLM was trained on. But let's say we're now building a custom chatbot we want to use internally within an organization. Now, we do want it to use it like a regular AI chatbot. We want to use it to revise and summarize and create human-like responses. But also, we want to be able to ask questions specific to our organization about our own data, our own people and projects and customers and products and procedures. So when we add retrieval augmented generation as a technique, this is a way to add a set of additional external data sources. This could be documents, PDFs, FAQs, internal guides, policies, procedures, could be perhaps transcriptions of video calls or the contents of Slack channels, whatever is important to us and to our business. And then when the user now sends a prompt to this custom app, the app will first check to see what are they asking about? Are they asking about just normal chatbot stuff? Or are they asking about that extra relevant company specific information? And if so, it will first get any additional information from those external data sources, additional facts, additional context. And all that extra information is bundled together with the original prompt, and then it is sent on to the LLM to formulate and structure the response, and finally send that response back to the user. And what this means, done well, is that we get all the benefits of having an LLM, and then we can generate new content. We can generate realistic human-like answers and conversations, but where those results are grounded in our own data and where we can keep that data up to date. So this helps offset several of those problems I just talked about, like having access to private proprietary data. It has more up-to-date information. It reduces hallucinations. And if we use RAG, we can require that any answer that used that external data must provide attribution, the source of where that answer came from. And while it doesn't completely take care of all ethical or legal issues, it should certainly offset them. Now, I wanted to talk about RAG for a minute or two, even at this basic level, because while this isn't a course on building a retrieval augmented generation application, it is still useful to know what RAG is and how it can help in using generative AI within an organization. We already see a lot of generative AI tools and services that are targeted to specific business areas, like generative AI for legal services, or generative AI for healthcare, or generative AI for finance. And it can be easy to think, well, maybe we should be focusing only on the tools that were built for the particular industry niche that I'm in. But that's not the case, because even though generative AI is a fairly new technology, we can already recognize that there are multiple repeated and quite straightforward and successful use cases that we can kind of summarize, and we can ask, well, is what I'm looking to do something more like this or something more like that? Here's what I mean. I'll say that right now, end of 2024, we can roughly group most current generative AI business use cases into just 4 main categories. Now, these might not be the most exciting categories, but they are pragmatic, they're real-world, practical applications, and they're generally applicable. First is using generative AI to deliver some kind of knowledge base. When I say some kind of knowledge base, you may not use those exact words. You might call it an information retrieval system or enterprise search, but it's this idea of using it to create an authoritative source of information. Now, this could either be internal or external facing, but where it includes your own data combined with an LLM to make the experience flexible and conversational and a single point of contact. Next is using generative AI for some kind of automated customer service. Most commonly, this would be a text chatbot, but it could also use voice or email or all of the above. Then there's using generative AI for some kind of domain-specific copilot. Now, I have to be careful with the word copilot because it's a little overused in generative AI. We have products like GitHub Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, Copilot for Microsoft 365. Now, I'm not talking about those. I'm just more talking about the idea of applications that are targeted at a specific business niche or task. For example, this is where I'd categorize some of those domain-specific services I mentioned a moment ago, like legal AI services specifically oriented around drafting and reviewing contracts. We're talking about generative AI that has moved beyond general purpose into being very context aware. It knows the jargon and terminology of that specific business use case, whether that's legal or construction or healthcare or aviation or software development or marketing or project management, and it has been fine-tuned around those specific needs of that niche, the most common questions, the most common tasks. Next, there is also just a substantial use case for some kind of general content assistance or assisted authoring, writing, summarization, emails, document generation. I might also include translation in this. And these are the low-hanging fruit of generative AI for business. And a lot of the products and services, the tools and applications, even custom applications, can be described as fitting into one or more of these categories. And these high-level use cases are probably more important than that specific domain or industry you work in. Because let's say you're considering whether to build or buy a customer chatbot for your business. Well, you could probably begin by just focusing on the general requirements of a good chatbot rather than thinking, I must find a solution specifically for the construction industry or specifically for the finance industry. Because when we talk about a chatbot, the general goals are the same. How do you provide company-specific data so it understands what's going on in your business? How do you predefine the most common customer questions? And then what are the indicators that suggest this conversation is going beyond automation and needs to be elevated to a person? And okay, I'm not going to say that every single generative AI business case will fit neatly into these, but it is useful to recognize there are generally applicable use cases regardless of the industry you're in. But yes, sometimes you need to look at more specialized, more targeted products and services, and we're going to talk about that too. The general purpose Gen AI chatbots are incredibly useful, but sometimes what you need are tools and applications that have been built around a particular business case. And one of the problems with this right now is just finding them, finding the right AI products and services when there are an overwhelming amount of them. Okay, the term overwhelming is usually exaggeration, but it's absolutely true here. This is an incredibly volatile industry right now. Even keeping track of the most popular LLMs can sometimes feel like a job. It seems like every week or two we get some surprise release from one or more of the major vendors. Just during the period where I was recording this, OpenAI first released GPT-4o, and then Anthropic followed that with Sonnet 3.5 for Claude. Meta released Llama 3.1, and then Google released Gemini 1.5 Pro, and all of them are adding new features and new capabilities. But on top of that, you also have hundreds, even thousands of smaller companies releasing AI platforms and services, some of them releasing tools and applications. And if you're looking for a way to kind of browse the marketplace and find all these available options, well, right now, a regular web search isn't a great way to do that because so much of this stuff is new. So neither is AI-assisted search because of the knowledge cutoff point. So it almost feels like we're going back to the early days of the internet when it was useful to have directories of websites and FTP areas and mailing lists because search just wasn't good enough. Now, these days, there are several web-based directories of AI products where people have tried to keep track of what new AI products and services exist and get them grouped and categorized. Now, there's quite a few of these websites, these directories. I don't think any of them are perfect. The three sites I use most often are futurepedia.io, there's an AI for that.com, and Product Hunt. And again, none of them are perfect, and some of them have paid placements, so just be aware of what you're looking at for recommendations. But between the three of them, you can get a pretty good overview of what is currently available right now. However, the next question becomes, how do you compare them? How do you evaluate these different possibilities? Whether it's something as general as which LLM will I use, or something more specific like how do I choose the best AI-driven CRM system for my business? Well, let's begin by talking about the LLMs, because this could be a personal choice. Let's say you've decided you want to buy a premium account for a chatbot, but you're not sure which one to use. Now, you might find just compare the pricing. You'd find that ChatGPT Plus account goes for $20 a month. And then there's Copilot Pro, which is $20 a month. And then there's Claude Professional Plan, which is $20 a month. Or you could save a penny and go with Gemini Advanced for $19.99. So, okay, the pricing doesn't make much difference here, but choosing an LLM can also be a business choice, not just personal. Let's say you're involved in a new project, a new application that's going to use generative AI. You need to decide on an LLM. Pricing becomes more complex, and you need to start asking additional questions like, should we use a closed source LLM like GPT or Claude, or an open source LLM like Llama or Mistral? Now, you might be just tempted to ask, well, what's the best one? There's a few reasons why that is not a great question. First, even though LLMs are general purpose, still, some of them are reliably better at certain tasks than others. Like some LLMs are better at questions involving code or math. Others are better at long and complicated questions. Others are quicker in their response. And all of these are things you'd have to take into consideration when you use them. But the next question becomes, well, okay, if they're different, how do you know? How do you recognize these differences? And how do you keep track of which ones are good at which things? Well, luckily, other people are continually figuring this out. We have websites like lmsys.org, the Large Model Systems Organization. This is run by a team out of UC Berkeley. And they have the Chatbot Arena. This sounds trivial. It isn't. It's a platform where they have a mechanism to perform comparisons between different LLMs. And they've done over 1 million comparisons. Basically, a person can give the same prompt to 2 different LLMs. They get back 2 results, and they make a judgment about which one is better, A or B. And it's a blind test. You don't know which LLMs you're evaluating. And they use a statistical model that's kind of similar to evaluating chess players. Just the results of one single test is not enough to make a worthwhile comparison. It's the same here. You don't just want to make a judgment based on one prompt. But with enough evaluations, enough comparisons, you can start to make a pretty good judgment. Now, right now, at the time I'm recording this, the overall leaderboard, Gemini 1.5 Pro had just moved into the top place and was followed by GPT-4o. But you can also split the results not just by the overall questions and prompts, but by different categories of prompts, like prompts that deal with math or following instructions or coding questions or hard prompts. For example, with coding questions, right now Anthropic Claude has taken the top spot. But if I asked which LLMs give better results for hard prompts written in English, well, that's currently GPT-4o. Now, there's a couple of things to take away from this. At the top of these charts, they're actually pretty close in their scores, but also they're kind of continually jockeying for position. Okay, Gemini 1.5 Pro might be number 1 at the time I'm recording this. Could be different tomorrow or next week or next month. But it is worthwhile to have this thoughtful, intentional comparison. And okay, This is for the most popular, the biggest LLMs. And you are not going to get this level of comparison just handed to you if you're trying to evaluate other generative AI products and services. But still, there are things you can think about beyond just the results you get. There's some core considerations when you're using any generative AI service, and we're going to get to that. If we're trying to evaluate several different generative AI products or services, whether that's a chatbot or some commercial API that we're considering using in our own applications, there are at least 6 factors we could make sure we're always paying attention to. Now, some of these will be more or less important at different times depending on your business case, but first, and in no particular order, we'd have just ease of use. One of the simplest questions. How easy is it to get the results we want? Does it take a lot of trial and error, a lot of customization? But there's also ease of integration. How well does this service play well with others? Can it be integrated easily into your own applications or other tools that you use? Is there an API with good documentation? Do they use fairly standard ways to do all of this? Now, of course, there's also the pricing model, the cost effectiveness. How do they charge for this service? And is the pricing at a fixed level, or do they start inexpensively and then ramp it up? And then have you modeled what it would cost with heavy usage of this? Have you thought about what would happen if they changed the pricing? We also need to think about the degree of lock-in. If we start using this service and it then changes or goes away completely, or the price suddenly jumps, how easy would it be to just take our data and go somewhere else? And one of the key things to consider with any generative AI is to think about the quality and consistency of the generated content. Not just, is it easy to get good results, but how consistent are those results? Is it fairly even and predictable? Or do you get great results sometimes and weird hallucinated results other times? Now, it is the case that some of this may be a subjective judgment that you have to make. It's one of the things that makes evaluation difficult of generative AI, because we don't get just some simple, repeatable, predictable result. We give it a prompt and we'll always get the same result back every time. No, we expect it to be slightly different, even with identical prompts. So yes, part of this is often a vibe check. How do I feel about the results that I just got back? But we also can't ignore things like data privacy and security measures. If we're using a commercial service, where's the data stored? Is our data used for training or refining their models? Are there any regulations or governance they have to think about? And okay, I could do a separate course on each of these, but still, we can begin by making sure we're at least bringing some attention to all of them and considering how they might change going forward. But I want to be careful here. I've been talking a lot about large-scale generative AI products and tools that were built from the ground up around these ideas. But for a lot of organizations and a lot of people, the impact of AI isn't just in having entirely new products and applications. It can be just as impactful when it's a small amount of AI built into an existing product. So while we can certainly think about these generative AI use cases from these top-down large categories, it's just as valuable to also think about it from the bottom up. And what I mean by that is not thinking about applications at all, but instead just asking, what is generative AI good at? What tasks can we use it for again and again in any kind of application, any kind of business case? And the kinds of things that we see again and again. We know generative AI is great at summarization, taking some text and boiling it down. It's great at paraphrasing and suggesting edits. It is great at general text generation, like coming up with product descriptions or reports. It's terrific on things like sentiment analysis to figure out the emotional tone of what someone's writing. It's good at language translation. It's great at generating sample data and many, many others, very small scale, specific tasks. And it's just as valuable to think about using it from the bottom up. I don't have to think about making new applications. I can just ask, could I use any of these tasks in my own day-to-day work? Well, probably. And when it comes to tying generative AI into your own work, I think it's much better to first think about it at this level, to think about these small individual tasks that it's good at and how you might use those one at a time, which can then lead to how you might also tie them together. When most people start using generative AI for themselves, it's very common to just use a chatbot and do things like rewrite emails or create job descriptions or plan a presentation or suggest a schedule for a team offsite. But using chatbots can often be quite a manual and intentional process. You have to decide that you're going to do it. It's almost swivel chair work. You need to leave the application that you were using, take some data over to your generative AI chatbot of choice, then use it, and then take the results and move them somewhere else. But we're seeing a lot more integration happening now. This year, things like Copilot being built into Microsoft Office 365 or Gemini being integrated into Google Docs, where you can prompt within the environment you're actually working in, whether that's to get first drafts or edits or suggestions. And that's one of the kind of boring but incredibly important aspects of this, because this is how generative AI will become more widespread, more adopted. Think of something as trivial as using spell check or autocorrect in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, or even just writing a text message on your phone. If you had to first write that text message and then copy and paste it over to a spell check application, then check it, then copy and paste the results back, even if that took just a few seconds, you probably wouldn't do it most of the time. But the fact that it's right there in the flow of work at your fingertips, you use it. But also, for those of you who remember how features like spell check and grammar check used to be when they were first integrated into applications but not automated, meaning when this was originally done, you had to choose to do it. You might write your document, and now you would go and find the menu option to spell check that document. But now it just happens. In a lot of applications, if you type the word accommodate with one C, it's just going to correct it for you as you type. You would have to opt out of that correction. And okay, sure, sometimes it overcorrects and makes the wrong guess. But for most people, most of the time, the benefits of having it built in outweigh those moments where you have to go back and change it. And it's worthwhile to expand this idea. What would I do if all of these different generative AI tasks and capabilities were just there? First, more integrated into the apps I use every day, and then also more automated. And even when what we're doing on a day-to-day basis might be very specific to us, it's to our own job, one of the ways this is happening, this integration and automation, is using generative AI agents. And it's time we talked about those. The thing with generative AI is people sometimes call ChatGPT the killer app, as if it's game over. OpenAI already won, we're done, that's it. But that's not true. And for most people, the real killer app of generative AI, the one that's going to change everything, is going to be custom. It isn't going to be just an app from the App Store. It's going to be an app that's very specific to you and to your role and the way that you work. And generative AI agents are a way that we're moving in that direction. Now, to talk meaningfully about AI agents, we first need familiarity with the various tasks that generative AI can do. And we also need to understand concepts like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, that ability to provide additional information and context, that ability to use an LLM in addition to our own systems and our own data. Because any business has multiple components. Yes, we have these great large language models, but we also have our own databases and our own document sources and our file servers and our internal applications and external systems like video conferencing apps and instant messaging apps. And we need a way to be able to tie all of this together in some flexible fashion, the way that right now we have to do as human beings. Well, okay, something happened over here, so I need to make a decision, and perhaps I need to call this person, and perhaps I need to then create that item. or check that account. And depending on what that says, I might then write that email or update that status and then send that message and then purchase that license, etc., etc. And agents are a way to create this ability for the different pieces to be connected to each other. But I want to be careful here, because one thing agents are good for, yes, is taking the output from one piece and sending it over to another. But that's kind of a misconception that all we're talking about here is just some kind of pipeline, this fixed, rigid, rule-driven way to just take output from one part of a larger system and send it to another part. And yes, agents can do this, but that's just kind of basic automation. That's not what we're talking about here, because the real benefit of generative AI agents is they don't just use an LLM as one piece of the puzzle, but the agents themselves, the little pieces of software that are managing this, they can use the LLM. That means they can be smarter, they can be flexible, they can respond to situations they haven't been explicitly programmed to handle, and they can still work. Now, one question people often had is, how do you do this? Well, as you might imagine, this is more complex than just using a pre-provided chatbot. So we often begin with a software framework or platform that's been built and intended to create applications with generative AI agents. And there's a few of these frameworks. Some of the better known ones include AutoGen from Microsoft. This is open source and freely available. There's also LangChain. That's another open source framework. You can use the Python language or JavaScript. There's also things like Crew.ai. Now, they're not identical, but they share the same idea that they're ways to define larger applications that can connect multiple pieces together, and where you can create an agent to oversee and orchestrate the interaction between the different pieces, but where that agent isn't just explicitly programmed to follow one set of predefined rules, but itself uses an LLM. It has some ability to reason, to be flexible, and to be able to break larger tasks into smaller ones. And an AI agent can also act. It can perform operations. It can use other tools. It can make calculations. It can decide to pause and ask a question of the user. But it could also access a database. It could run some code. It could talk to some other generative AI tool. It could access memory, which means it can save information and retrieve it later. Now, agents can be created for multiple different reasons, because this idea is useful at both a large scale. Perhaps you might create an agent for customer service interactions that might be used by tens of thousands of people. And it's a way to interact through a chatbot where the chatbot is part of the agent. But also, an agent could be created just for a single person, almost like having a digital assistant. For example, imagine a customer service agent for an e-commerce company. You can think of examples like Amazon's Rufus. This agent doesn't just answer common questions. It can handle tasks like order modifications or product recommendations, even processing returns. It can look at a customer's purchase history and their browsing behavior, and whatever they're asking about, it can offer them more personalized solutions. If a customer asks about exchanging a shirt for a different size, that agent could decide to check the inventory, then process that exchange and send a replacement label and update the shipping details and even suggest some complementary items all in one conversation. But at the other end of the scale, the more personal level, you might have a marketing manager who can have their own AI agent tailored to that specific role. So that agent could be provided with data about the company brand guidelines and past marketing campaigns and industry terms and competitors. And the manager could use that agent to generate ideas for marketing campaigns, to draft up social media posts and newsletters, to analyze the campaign performance data and suggest optimizations, to keep track of various project deadlines and team assignments. It could summarize industry reports. It could look at competitor activity. And the manager could then just interact with the agent throughout the day. And because the agent can save information, it can continually refine its outputs with feedback. And you could teach it better preferences over time. So this is another place where I could do an entire course just on agents. But if you want to explore, take a look at those frameworks like AutoGen and LangChain. Now, there are some that promise low code and even no code environments for doing this. Platforms like Zapier now have Zapier Central, a way to build AI assistants, a similar idea to agents, but most of this is drag and drop. Now, I'll admit that as a software developer, I still feel like I quickly run up against a wall when I try and constrain myself to just using no code solutions. Because while the tools are getting better and better at figuring out what we want, we're still at a time where knowing some Python or knowing some JavaScript is incredibly valuable. But with that, I'm going to wrap up. I hope you found this course useful. Hope it's given you a few things to explore and think about. I'll see you next time.